Chapter 13 of The Flaming Forest. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Flaming Forest by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 13. The morning passed like a dream to Carrigan. He permitted himself to live and breathe it as one who finds himself for a space in the heart of a golden mirage. He was sitting so near Marie Anne that now and then the faint perfume of her came to him like the delicate scent of a flower. It was a breath of crushed violets, sweet as the air he was breathing, violets gathered in the deep cool of the forest, a whisper of sweetness about her, as if on her bosom she wore always the living flowers. He fancied her gathering the last bloom time, a year ago, alone, her feet seeking out the damp mosses, her little fingers plucking the smiling and laughing faces of the violet flowers to be treasured away in fragrant sachets, as gentle as the wood thrush's note compared with the bottled aromas 1,500 miles south. It seemed to be a physical part of her, a thing born of the glow in her cheeks, a living exhilaration of her soft red lips, and yet only when he was near, very near, did the life of it reach him. She did not know he was thinking these things. There was nothing in his voice, he thought, to betray him. He was sure she was unconscious of the fight he was making. Her eyes smiled and laughed with him, she counted her stitches, her fingers worked, and she talked to him as she might have talked to a friend of St. Pierre's. She told him how St. Pierre had made the barge, the largest that had ever been on the river, and that he had built it entirely of dry cedar, so that it floated like a feather wherever there was water enough to run a York boat. She told him how St. Pierre had brought the piano down from Edmonton, and how he had saved it from pitching in the river by carrying the full weight of it on his shoulders when they met with an accident in running through a dangerous rapids bringing it down. St. Pierre was a very strong man, she said, a note of pride in her voice. And then she added, "Sometimes, when he picks me up in his arms, I feel that he is going to squeeze the life out of me." Her words were like a sharp thrust into his heart. For an instant they painted a vision for him, a picture of that slim and adorable creature crushed close in the great arms of St. Pierre, so close that she could not breathe. In that mad moment of his hurt it was almost a living, breathing reality for him there on the golden foredeck of the scow. He turned his face toward the far shore, where the wilderness seemed to reach off into eternity. What a glory it was, the green seas of spruce and cedar and balsam, the ridges of poplar and birch rising like silvery spume above the darker billows, and afar off, mellowed in the sun mists, the guardian crests of Trout Mountains, sentineling the country beyond. Into that mystery land on the farther side of the Wabiskaw waterways Carrigan would have loved to set his foot 4 days ago. It was that mystery of the unpeopled places that he most desired, their silence, the comradeship of spaces untrod by the feet of man. And now what a fool he was! Through vast distances the forests he loved seemed to whisper it to him, and ahead of him the river seemed to look back, nodding over its shoulder, beckoning to him, telling him the word of the forests was true. It streamed on lazily, half a mile wide, as if resting for the splashing and roaring rush it would make among the rocks of the next rapids, and in its indolence it sang the low and everlasting song of deep and slowly passing water. In that song David heard the same whisper, that he was a fool. And the lure of the wilderness shores crept in on him and gripped him as of old. He looked at the rowers in the 2 York boats, and then his eyes came back to the end of the barge and to St. Pierre's wife. Her little toes were tapping the floor of the deck. She, too, was looking out over the wilderness. And again it seemed to him that she was like a bird that wanted to fly. "I should like to go into those hills," she said without looking at him. "Away off yonder." "And I should like to go with you." "You love all that, m'sieu?" she asked. "Yes, madam." "Why 'madam' when I have given you permission to call me Marie Anne?" she demanded. "Because you call me m'sieu." "But you have not given me permission—" "Then I do now," he interrupted quickly. "Merci. I have wondered why you did not return the courtesy." She laughed softly. "I do not like the m'sieu. I shall call you David." She rose out of the hammock suddenly and dropped her needles and lacework into the little basket. "I have forgotten something. It is for you to eat when it comes dinner time, David. So I must turn fille de cuisine for a little while. That is what St. Pierre sometimes calls me, because I love to play at cooking. I'm going to bake a pie." The dark screen door of the kitchenette closed behind her, and Carrigan walked out from under the awning so that the sun beat down upon him. There was no longer a doubt in his mind. He was more than a fool. He envied St. Pierre, and he coveted that which St. Pierre possessed. And yet, before he would take what did not belong to him, he knew he would put a pistol to his head and blow his life out. He was confident of himself there. Yet he had fallen, and out of the mire into which he had sunk he knew also that he must drag himself, and quickly, or be everlastingly lowered in his own esteem. He stripped himself naked and did not lie to that other and greater thing of life that was in him. He was not only a fool, but a coward. Only a coward would have touched the hair of St. Pierre's wife with his lips. Only a coward would have let live the thoughts that burned in his brain. She was St. Pierre's wife, and he was anxious now for the quick homecoming of the chief of the Boulains. After that everything would happen quickly. He thanked God that the inspiration of the wager had come to him. After the fight, after he had won, then once more he would be the old Dave Carrigan, holding the trump hand in a thrilling game. Loud voices from the York boats ahead and answering cries from Bateese in the stern drew him to the open deck. The bateau was close to shore, and the half-breed was working the long stern sweep as if the power of a steam engine was in his mighty arms. The York boats had shortened their tow line and were pulling at right angles within a few yards of a gravelly beach. A few strokes more, and men who were bare to the knees jumped out into the shallow water and began tugging at the tow rope with their hands. David looked at his watch. It was 10 o'clock. Never in his life had time passed so swiftly as that morning on the forward deck of the barge. And now they were tying up, after a drop of 6 or 8 miles down the river, and he wondered how swiftly St. Pierre was overtaking them with his raft. He was filled with the desire to feel the soft crush of the earth under his feet again, and not wanting for the long plank that Bateese was already swinging from the scow to the shore, he made a leap that put him on the sandy beach. St. Pierre's wife had given him this permission, and he looked to see what effect his act had on the half-breed. The face of Concombre Bateese was like sullen stone. Not a sound came from his thick lips, but in the eyes was a deep and dangerous fire as he looked at Carrigan. There was no need for words. In them were suspicion, warning, the deadly threat of what would happen if he did not come back when it was time to return. David nodded. He understood. Even though St. Pierre's wife had faith in him, Bateese had not. He passed between the men, and to a man their faces turned on him, and in their quiet and watchful eyes he saw again that warning and suspicion, the unspoken threat of what would happen if he forgot his promise to Marie Anne Boulain. Never in a single outfit had he seen such splendid men. They were not a mongrel assortment of the lower country. Slim, tall, clean-cut, sinewy. They were stock of the old voyageurs of 100 years ago, and all of them were young. The older men had gone to St. Pierre. The reason for this dawned upon Carrigan. Not one of these 12 but could beat him in a race through the forest. Not one that could not outrun him and cut him off, though he had hours the start. Passing beyond them, he paused and looked back at the bateau. On the forward deck stood Marie Anne, and she, too, was looking at him now. Even at that distance he saw that her face was quiet and troubled with anxiety. She did not smile when he lifted his hat to her, but gave only a little nod. Then he turned and buried himself in the green balsams that grew within 50 paces of the river. The old joy of life leaped into him as his feet crushed in the soft moss of the shaded places where the sun did not break through. He went on, passing through a vast and silent cathedral of spruce and cedar so dense that the sky was hidden, and came then to higher ground, where the evergreen was sprinkled with birch and poplar. About him was an invisible choir of voices, the low twittering of timid little graybacks, the song of hidden warblers, the scolding of distant jays. Big-eyed moose birds stared at him as he passed, fluttering so close to his face that they almost touched his shoulders in their foolish inquisitiveness. A porcupine crashed within a dozen feet of his trail. And then he came to a beaten path, and other paths worn deep in the cool, damp earth by the hoofs of moose and caribou. Half a mile from the bateau he sat down on a rotting log and filled his pipe with fresh tobacco, while he listened to catch the subdued voice of the life in this land that he loved. It was then that the curious feeling came over him that he was not alone, that other eyes than those of beast and bird were watching him. It was an impression that grew on him. He seemed to feel their stare, seeking him out from the darkest coverts, waiting for him to shove on, dogging him like a ghost. Within him the hound-like instincts of the man-hunter rose swiftly to the suspicion of invisible presence. He began to note the changes in the cries of certain birds. 100 yards on his right, a jay, most talkative of all the forest things, was screeching with a new note in its voice. On the other side of him, in a dense pocket of poplar and spruce, a warbler suddenly brought its song to a jerky end. He heard the excited pee-wee, pee-wee, pee-wee of a startled little grayback giving warning of an unwelcome intruder near its nest. And he rose to his feet, laughing softly as he thumbed down the tobacco in his pipe. Jeanne Marie Anne Boulain might believe in him, but Bateese and her wary henchmen had ways of their own of strengthening their faith. It was close to noon when he turned back, and he did not return by the moose path. Deliberately he struck out 100 yards on either side of it, traveling where the moss grew thick and the earth was damp and soft. And 5 times he found the moccasin prints of men. Bateese, with his sleeves up, was scrubbing the deck of the bateau when David came over the plank. "There are moose and caribou in there, but I fear I disturbed your hunters," said Carrigan, grinning at the half-breed. "They are too clumsy to hunt well, so clumsy that even the birds give them away. I am afraid we shall go without fresh meat tomorrow." Concombre Bateese stared as if some one had stunned him with a blow, and he spoke no word as David went on to the forward deck. Marie Anne had come out under the awning. She gave a little cry of relief and pleasure. "I am glad you have come back, M'sieu David." "So am I, madame," he replied. "I think the woods are unhealthful to travel in." Out of the earth he felt that a part of the old strength had returned to him. Alone they sat at dinner, and Marie Anne waited on him and called him David again, and he found it easier now to call her Marie Anne and look into her eyes without fear that he was betraying himself. A part of the afternoon he spent in her company, and it was not difficult for him to tell her something of his adventuring in the north. and how, body and soul, the Northland had claimed him, and that he hoped to die in it when his time came. Her eyes glowed at that. She told him of 2 years she had spent in Montreal and Quebec, of her homesickness, her joy when she returned to her forests. It seemed, for a time, that they had forgotten St. Pierre. They did not speak of him. Twice they saw Andre, the Broken Man, but the name of Roger Audemard was not spoken. And a little at a time she told him of the hidden paradise of the Boulains, away up in the unmapped wilderness of the Yellowknife beyond the Great Bear, and of the great log chateau that was her home. A part of the afternoon he spent on shore. He filled a moose hide bag full of sand and suspended it from the limb of a tree, and for 3/4 of an hour pommeled it with his fists, much to the curiosity and amusement of St. Pierre's men, who could see nothing of man fighting in these antics. But the exercise assured David that he had lost but little of his strength and that he would be in form to meet Bateese when the time came. Toward evening Marie Anne joined him, and they walked for half an hour up and down the beach. It was Bateese who got supper. And after that Carrigan sat with Marie Anne on the foredeck of the barge and smoked another of St. Pierre's cigars. The camp of the rivermen was 200 yards below the bateau, screened between by a finger of hardwood, so that except when they broke into a chorus of laughter or strengthened their throats with snatches of song, there was no sound of their voices. But Bateese was in the stern, and Nepapinas was forever flitting in and out among the shadows on the shore, like a shadow himself, and Andre, the Broken Man, hovered near as night came on. At last he sat down on the edge of the white sand of the beach, and there he remained, a silent and lonely figure as the twilight deepened. Over the world hovered a sleepy quiet. Out of the forest came the droning of the wood crickets, the last twitterings of the day birds, and the beginning of night sounds. A great shadow floated out over the river close to the bateau, the first of the questing, blood-seeking owls adventuring out like pirates from their hiding places of the day. One after another, as the darkness thickened, the different tribes of the people of the night answered the summons of the first stars. A mile down the river a loon gave its harsh love cry. Far out of the west came the faint trail song of a wolf. In the river the night-feeding trout splashed like the tails of beaver. Over the roof of the wilderness came the coughing, moaning challenge of a bull moose that yearned for battle. And over these same forest tops rose the moon, the stars grew thicker and brighter, and through the finger of hardwood glowed the fire of St. Pierre Boulain's men, while close beside them, silent in these hours of silence, David felt growing nearer and still nearer to him the presence of St. Pierre's wife. On the strip of sand Andre, the Broken Man, rose and stood like the stub of a misshapen tree. And then slowly he moved on and was swallowed up in the mellow glow of the night. "It is at night that he seeks," said St. Pierre's wife, for it was as if David had spoken the thought that was in his mind. David, for a moment, was silent. And then he said, "You asked me to tell you about Black Roger Audemard. I will, if you care to have me. Do you?" He saw the nodding of her head, though the moon and star mist veiled her face. "Yes. What do the police say about Roger Audemard?" He told her, and not once in the telling of the story did she speak or move. It was a terrible story at best, he thought, but he did not weaken it by smoothing over the details. This was his opportunity. He wanted her to know why he must possess the body of Roger Audemard, if not alive, then dead, and he wanted her to understand how important it was that he learn more about Andre, the Broken Man. "He was a fiend, this Roger Audemard," he began. "A devil in man shape, afterward called Black Roger, because of the color of his soul. Then he went on. He described Hatchet River Post, where the tragedy had happened, then told of the fight that came about one day between Roger Audemard and the factor of the post and his 2 sons. It was an unfair fight, he conceded that. 3-1 was cowardly in a fight. But it could not excuse what happened afterward. Audemard was beaten. He crept off into the forest, almost dead. Then he came back one stormy night in the winter with 3 strange friends. Who the friends were the police never learned. There was a fight, but all through the fight Black Roger Audemard cried out not to kill the factor and his sons. In spite of that, one of the sons was killed. Then the terrible thing happened. The father and his remaining son were bound hand and foot and fastened in the ancient dungeon room under the post building. Then Black Roger set the building on fire, and stood outside in the storm and laughed like a madman at the dying shrieks of his victims. It was the season when the trappers were on their lines, and there were but few people at the post. The company clerk and one other attempted to interfere, and Black Roger killed them with his own hands. 5 deaths that night, 2 of them horrible beyond description. Resting for a moment, Carrigan went on to tell of the long years of unavailing search made by the police after that, how Black Roger was caught once and killed his captor. Then came the rumor that he was dead, and rumor grew into official belief, and the police no longer hunted for his trails. Then, not long ago, came the discovery that Black Roger was still living, and he, Dave Carrigan, was after him. For a time there was silence after he had finished. Then St. Pierre's wife rose to her feet. "I wonder," she said in a low voice, "what Roger Audemard's own story might be if he were here to tell it." She stepped out from under the awning, and in the full radiance of the moon he saw the pale beauty of her face and the crowning luster of her hair. "Good night," she whispered. "Good night," said David. He listened until her retreating footsteps died away, and for hours after that he had no thought of sleep. He had insisted that she take possession of her cabin again, and Bateese had brought out a bundle of blankets. These he spread under the awning, and when he drowsed off it was to dream of the lovely face he had seen last in the glow of the moon. It was in the afternoon of the 4th day that 2 things happened, one that he had prepared himself for, and another so unexpected that for a space it sent his world crashing out of its orbit. With St. Pierre's wife he had gone again to the ridge line for flowers, 1/2 mile back from the river. Returning a new way, they came to a shallow stream, and Marie Anne stood at the edge of it, and there was laughter in her shining eyes as she looked to the other side of it. She had twined flowers into her hair. Her cheeks were rich with color, her slim figure was exquisite in its wild pulse of life. Suddenly she turned on him, her red lips smiling their witchery in his face. "You must carry me across," she said. He did not answer. He was a-tremble as he drew near her. She raised her arms a little, waiting. And then he picked her up. She was against his breast. Her 2 hands went to his shoulders as he waded into the stream. He slipped, and they clung a little tighter. The soft note of laughter was in her throat when the current came to his knees out in the middle of the stream. He held her tighter. And then, stupidly, he slipped again, and the movement brought her lower in his arms, so that for a space her head was against his breast and his face was crushed in the soft masses of her hair. He came with her that way to the opposite shore and stood her on her feet again, standing back quickly so that she would not hear the pounding of his heart. Her face was radiantly beautiful, and she did not look at David, but away from him. "Thank you," she said. And then, suddenly, they heard running feet behind them, and in another moment one of the brigade men came dashing through the stream. At the same time there came from the river a quarter of a mile away a thunderous burst of voice. It was not the voice of a dozen men, but of 100, and Marie Anne grew tense, listening, her eyes on fire even before the messenger could get the words out of his mouth.
"It is St. Pierre!"
he cried then.
"He has come with the great raft, and you must hurry if you would reach the bateau before he lands."
In that moment it seemed to David that Marie Anne forgot he was alive. A little cry came to her lips, and then she left him, running swiftly, saying no word to him, flying with the speed of a fawn to St. Pierre Boulain. And when David turned to the man who had come up behind them, there was a strange smile on the lips of the lithe-limbed forest runner as his eyes followed the hurrying figure of St. Pierre's wife. Until she was out of sight, he stood in silence, and then he said, "Come on, monsieur. We also must meet St. Pierre." End of chapter 13. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 14 of The Flaming Forest. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Flaming Forest by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 14. David moved slowly behind the brigade man. He had no desire to hurry. He did not wish to see what happened when Marie Anne met St. Pierre Boulain. Only a moment ago she had been in his arms. Her hair had smothered his face. Her hands had clung to his shoulders. Her flushed cheeks and long lashes had, for an instant, lain close against his breast. And now, swiftly, without a word of apology, she was running away from him to meet her husband. He almost spoke that word aloud as he saw the last of her slim figure among the silver birches. She was going to the man to whom she belonged, and there was no hesitation in the manner of her going. She was glad. And she was entirely forgetful of him, Dave Carrigan, in that gladness. He quickened his steps, narrowing the distance between him and the hurrying brigade man. Only the diseased thoughts in his brain had made the happening in the creek anything but an accident. It was all an accident, he told himself. Marie Anne had asked him to carry her across, just as she would have asked any one of her rivermen. It was his fault, and not hers, that he had slipped in mid-stream, and that his arms had closed tighter about her, and that her hair had brushed his face. He remembered she had laughed, when it seemed for a moment that they were going to fall into the stream together. Probably she would tell St. Pierre all about it. Surely she would never guess it had been nearer tragedy than comedy for him. Once more he was convinced he had proved himself a weakling and a fool. His business now was with St. Pierre, and the hour was at hand when the game had ceased to be a woman's game. He had looked ahead to this hour. He had prepared himself for it, and had promised himself action that would be both quick and decisive. And yet, as he went on, his heart was still thumping unsteadily, and in his arms and against his face remained still the sweet, warm thrill of his contact with Marie Anne. He could not drive that from him. It would never completely go. As long as he lived, what had happened in the creek would live with him. He did not deny that crying voice inside him. It was easy for his mouth to make words. He could call himself a fool and a weakling, but those words were purely mechanical, hollow, meaningless. The truth remained. It was a blazing fire in his breast, a conflagration that might easily get the best of him, a thing which he might fight and triumph over for his own salvation. He did not think of danger for Marie Anne, for such a thought was inconceivable. The tragedy was one-sided. It was his own folly, his own danger. For just as he loved Marie Anne, so did she love her husband, St. Pierre. He came to the low ridge close to the river and climbed up through the thick birches and poplars. At the top was a bald knob of sandstone, over which the rivermen had already passed. David paused there and looked down on the broad sweep of the Athabasca. What he saw was like a picture, spread out on the great breast of the river and the white strip of shoreline. Still a quarter of a mile upstream, floating down slowly with the current, was a mighty raft, and for a space his eyes took in nothing else. On the Mackenzie, the Athabasca, the Saskatchewan, and the Peace he had seen many rafts, but never a raft like this of St. Pierre Boulain. It was 100 feet in width and twice and a half times as long, and with the sun blazing down upon it from out of the cloudless sky, it looked to him like a little city swept up from out of some archaic and savage desert land to be transplanted to the river. It was dotted with tents and canvas shelters. Some of these were gray and some were white, and 2 or 3 were striped with broad bands of yellow and red. Behind all these was a cabin, and over this there rose a slender staff from which floated the black and white pennant of St. Pierre. The raft was alive. Men were running between the tents. The long rudder sweeps were flashing in the sun. Rowers with naked arms and shoulders were straining their muscles in 4 York boats that were pulling like ants at the giant mass of timber. And to David's ears came a deep monotone of human voices, the chanting of the men as they worked. Nearer to him a louder response suddenly made answer to it. A dozen steps carried him round a projecting thumb of brush, and he could see the open shore where the bateau was tied. Marie Anne had crossed the strip of sand, and Bateese was helping her into a waiting York boat. Then Bateese shoved it off, and the 4 men in it began to row. 2 canoes were already halfway to the raft, and David recognized the occupant of one of them as Andre, the Broken Man. Then he saw Marie Anne rise in the York boat and wave something white in her hand. He looked again toward the raft. The current and the sweeps and the tugging boats were drawing it steadily nearer. Standing at the very edge of it he saw now a solitary figure, and in the clear sunlight the man stood out clean-cut as a carven statue. He was a giant in size. His head and arms were bare, and he was looking steadily toward the bateau and the approaching York boat. He raised an arm, and a moment later the movement was followed by a voice that rose above all other voices. It boomed over the river like the rumble of a gun. In response to it Marie Anne waved the white thing in her hand, and David thought he heard her voice in an answering cry. He stared again at the solitary figure of the man, seeing nothing else, hearing no other sound but the booming of the deep cry that came again over the river. His heart was thumping. In his eyes was a gathering fire. His body grew tense. For he knew that at last he was looking at St. Pierre, chief of the Boulains and husband of the woman he loved. As the significance of the situation grew upon him, a flash of his old humor returned. It was the same grim humor that had possessed him behind the rock, when he had thought he was going to die. Fate had played him a dishonest turn then, and it was doing the same thing by him now. Unless he deliberately turned his face away, he was going to see the reunion of Marie Anne and St. Pierre. Yesterday he had strapped his binoculars to his belt. Today Marie Anne had looked through them a dozen times. They had been a source of pleasure and thrill to her. Now, David thought, they would be good medicine for him. He would see the whole thing through, and at close range. He would leave himself no room for doubt. He had laughed behind the rock when bullets were zipping close to his head, and the same grim smile came to his lips now as he focused his glasses on the solitary figure at the head of the raft. The smile died away when he saw St. Pierre. It was as if he could reach out and touch him with his hand. And never, he thought, had he seen such a man. A moment before, a flashing vision had come to him from out of an Arabian desert, the multitude of colored tents, the half-naked men, the great raft floating almost without perceptible motion in the placid breast of the river, had stirred his imagination until he saw a strange picture. But there was nothing Arabic, nothing desert-like, in this man his binoculars brought within a few feet of his eyes. He was more like a Viking pirate who had roved the sea a few centuries ago. One great bare arm was raised as David looked, and his booming voice was rolling over the river again. His hair was shaggy and untrimmed and red. He wore a short beard that glistened in the sun. He was laughing as he waved and shouted to Marie Anne. A joyous, splendid giant of a man, who seemed almost on the point of leaping into the water in his eagerness to clasp in the naked arms the woman who was coming to him. David drew a deep breath, and there came an unconscious tightening at his heart as he turned his glasses upon Marie Anne. She was still standing in the bow of the York boat, and her back was toward him. He could see the glisten of the sun in her hair. She was waving her handkerchief, and the poise of her slim body told him that in her eagerness she would have darted from the bow of the boat had she possessed wings. Again he looked at St. Pierre. And this was the man who was no match for Concombre Bateese. It was inconceivable. Yet he heard Marie Anne's voice repeating those very words in his ear. But she had surely been joking with him. She had been storing up this little surprise for him. She had wanted him to discover with his own eyes what a splendid man was this chief of the Boulains. And yet, as David stared, there came to him an unpleasant thought of the incongruity of this thing he was looking upon. It struck upon him like a clashing discord, the fact of matehood between these two, a condition inconsistent and out of tune with the beautiful things he had built up in his mind about the woman. In his soul he had enshrined her as a lovely wildflower, easily crushed, easily destroyed, a sweet treasure to be guarded from all that was rough and savage, a little violet goddess, as fragile as she was brave and loyal. And St. Pierre, standing there at the edge of his raft, looked as if he had come up out of the caves of 1,000,000 years ago. There was something barbaric about him. He needed only a club and a shield and the skin of a beast about his loins to transform him into prehistoric man. At least, these were his first impressions, impressions roused by thought of Marie Anne's slim, beautiful body crushed close in the embrace of that laughing, powerful lunged giant. Then the reaction swept over him. St. Pierre was not a monster, even though his disturbed mind unconsciously made an effort to conceive him as such. There were gladness and laughter in his face. There was the contagion of joy and good cheer in the voice that boomed over the water. Laughter and shouts answered it from the shore. The rowers in Marie Anne's York boat burst into a wild and exultant snatch of song and made their oars fairly crack. There came a solitary yell from Andre, the Broken Man, who was close to the head of the raft now. And from the raft itself came a slowly swelling volume of sound, the urge and voice and exultation of red-blooded men, athrill with the glory of this day and the wild freedom of their world. The truth came to David. St. Pierre Boulain was the beloved big brother of his people. He waited, his muscles tense, his jaws set tight. Good medicine, he called it again, a righteous sort of punishment set upon him for the moral cowardice he had betrayed in falling down in worship at the feet of another man's wife. The York boat was very close to the head of the raft now. He saw Marie Anne herself fling a rope to St. Pierre. Then the boat swung alongside. In another moment St. Pierre had leaned over, and Marie Anne was with him on the raft. For a space everything else in the world was obliterated for David. He saw St. Pierre's arms gather the slim form into their embrace. He saw Marie Anne's hands go up fondly to the bearded face. And then Carrigan cut the picture there. He turned his shoulder to the raft and snapped the binoculars in the case at his belt. Someone was coming in his direction from the bateau. It was the riverman who had brought to Marie Anne the news of St. Pierre's arrival. David went down to meet him. From the foot of the ridge he again turned his eyes in the direction of the raft. St. Pierre and Marie Anne were just about to enter the little cabin built in the center of the drifting mass of timber. End of chapter 14. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 15 of The Flaming Forest. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Flaming Forest by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 15. It was easy for Carrigan to guess why the riverman had turned back for him. Men were busy about the bateau, and Concombre Bateese stood in the stern, a long pole in his hands, giving commands to the others. The bateau was beginning to swing out into the stream when he leaped aboard. A wide grin spread over the half-breed's face. He eyed David keenly and laughed in his deep chest, an unmistakable suggestiveness in the note of it. "You look seek, monsieur," he said in an undertone, for David's ears alone. "You look very unhappy and pale, like a little boy. What happened when you look through the glass up there, eh? Or is it that you grow frightened because very soon you stand up and fight Concombre Bateese? Eh, Coq de Bruyere? Is it that?" A quick thought came to David. "Is it true that St. Pierre cannot whip you, Bateese?" Bateese threw out his chest with a mighty intake of breath. Then he exploded. "No man in all Three River can whip Concombre Bateese." "And St. Pierre is a powerful man," mused David, letting his eyes travel slowly from the half-breed's moccasined feet to the top of his head. "I measured him well through the glasses, Bateese. It will be a great fight. But I shall whip you." He did not wait for the half-breed to reply, but went into the cabin and closed the door behind him. He did not like the taunting note of suggestiveness in the other's words. Was it possible that Bateese suspected the true state of his mind, that he was in love with the wife of St. Pierre, and that his heart was sick because of what he had seen aboard the raft? He flushed hotly. It made him uncomfortable to feel that even the half-breed might have guessed his humiliation. David looked through the window toward the raft. The bateau was drifting downstream, possibly 100 feet from the shore, but it was quite evident that Concombre Bateese was making no effort to bring it close to the floating mass of timber, which had made no change in its course down the river. David's mind painted swiftly what was happening in the cabin into which Marie Anne and St. Pierre had disappeared. At this moment Marie Anne was telling of him, of the adventure in the hot patch of sand. He fancied the suppressed excitement in her voice as she unburdened herself. He saw St. Pierre's face darken, his muscles tighten, and, crouching in silence, he seemed to see the misshapen hulk of Andre, the Broken Man, listening to what was passing between the other two. And he heard again the mad monotone of Andre's voice, crying plaintively, "Has anyone seen Black Roger Audemard?" His blood ran a little faster, and his old craft was a dominantly living thing within him once more. Love had dulled both his ingenuity and his desire. For a space a thing had risen before him that was mightier than the majesty of the law, and he had tried to miss the bull's-eye, because of his love for the wife of St. Pierre Boulain. Now he shot squarely for it, and the bell rang in his brain. 2 times 2 again made 4. Facts assembled themselves like arguments in flesh and blood. Those facts would have convinced Superintendent McVane, and they now convinced David. He had set out to get Black Roger Audemard, alive or dead. And Black Roger, wholesale murderer, a monster who had painted the blackest page of crime known in the history of Canadian law, was closely and vitally associated with Marie Anne and St. Pierre Boulain. The thing was a shock, but Carrigan no longer tried to evade the point. His business was no longer with a man supposed to be 1,000 or 1,500 miles farther north. It was with Marie Anne, St. Pierre, and Andre the Broken Man, and also with Concombre Bateese. He smiled a little grimly as he thought of his approaching battle with the half-breed. St. Pierre would be astounded at the proposition he had in store for him, but he was sure that St. Pierre would accept. And then, if he won the fight with Bateese— The smile faded from his lips. His face grew older as he looked slowly about the bateau cabin, with its sweet and lingering whispers of a woman's presence. It was a part of her. It breathed of her fragrance and her beauty. It seemed to be waiting for her, crying softly for her return. Yet once had there been another woman even lovelier than the wife of St. Pierre. He had not hesitated then. Without great effort he had triumphed over the loveliness of Carmin Fanchet, and had sent her brother to the hangman. And now, as he recalled those days, the truth came to him that even in the darkest hour Carmin Fanchet had made not the slightest effort to buy him off with her beauty. She had not tried to lure him. She had fought proudly and defiantly. And had Marie Anne done that? His fingers clenched slowly, and a thickening came in his throat. Would she tell St. Pierre of the many hours they had spent together? Would she confess to him the secret of that precious moment when she had lain close against his breast, her arms about him, her face pressed to his? Would she speak to him of secret hours, of warm flushes that had come to her face, of glowing fires that at times had burned in her eyes when he had been very near to her? Would she reveal everything to St. Pierre, her husband? He was powerless to combat the voice that told him no. Carmin Fanchet had fought him openly as an enemy and had not employed her beauty as a weapon. Marie Anne had put in his way a great temptation. What he was thinking seemed to him like a sacrilege, yet he knew there could be no discriminating distinctions between weapons, now that he was determined to play the game to the end, for the law. When Carrigan went out on deck, the half-breed was sweating from his exertion at the stern sweep. He looked at the agent de police who was going to fight him, perhaps tomorrow or the next day. There was a change in Carrigan. He was not the same man who had gone into the cabin an hour before, and the fact impressed itself upon Bateese. There was something in his appearance that held back the loose talk at the end of Concombre's tongue. And so it was Carrigan himself who spoke first. "When will this man St. Pierre come to see me?" he demanded. "If he doesn't come soon, I shall go to him." For an instant Concombre's face darkened. Then, as he bent over the sweep with his great back to David, he chuckled audibly and said, "Would you go, monsieur? Ah, it is le malade d'amour over there in the cabin. Surely you would not break in upon their love-making." Bateese did not look over his shoulder, and so he did not see the hot flush that gathered in David's face. But David was sure he knew it was there, and that Concombre had guessed the truth of matters. There was a sly note in his voice, as if he could not quite keep to himself his exultation that beauty and bright eyes had played a clever trick on this man who, if his own judgment had been followed, would now be resting peacefully at the bottom of the river. It was the final stab to Carrigan. His muscles tensed. For the first time he felt the desire to shoot a naked fist into the grinning mouth of Concombre Bateese. He laid a hand on the half-breed's shoulder, and Bateese turned about slowly. He saw what was in the other's eyes. "Until this moment I have not known what a great pleasure it will be to fight you, Bateese," said David quietly. "Make it tomorrow, in the morning if you wish. Take word to St. Pierre that I will make him a great wager that I win, a gamble so large that I think he will be afraid to cover it. For I don't think much of this St. Pierre of yours, Bateese. I believe him to be a big-winded bluff, like yourself. And also a coward. Mark my word, he will be so much afraid that he will not accept my wager." Bateese did not answer. He was looking over David's shoulder. He seemed not to have heard what the other had said, yet there had come a sudden gleam of exultation in his eyes, and he replied, still gazing toward the raft, "Diantre, monsieur, Coq de Bruyere may keep ze big word in hees mout. See? St. Pierre, he is coming to answer for himself. Mon Dieu, I hope he does not wring ze little rooster's neck, for zat would spoil one great, grand fight tomorrow." David turned toward the big raft. At the distance which separated them he could make out the giant figure of St. Pierre Boulain getting into a canoe. The humped-up form already in that canoe he knew was the Broken Man. He could not see Marie Anne. Very lightly Bateese touched his arm. "M'sieu will go into ze cabin," he suggested softly. "If something happens, it ees best too many eyes do not see it. You understand, M'sieu Agent de Police?" Carrigan nodded. "I understand," he said. End of chapter 15. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 16 of The Flaming Forest. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Flaming Forest by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 16. In the cabin David waited. He did not look through the window to watch St. Pierre's approach. He sat down and picked up a magazine from the table upon which Marie Anne's work-basket lay. He was cool as ice now. His blood flowed evenly and his pulse beat unhurriedly. Never had he felt himself more his own master, more like grappling with a situation. St. Pierre was coming to fight. He had no doubt of that. Perhaps not physically at first. But one way or another, something dynamic was bound to happen in the bateau cabin within the next half hour. Now that the impending drama was close at hand, Carrigan's scheme of luring St. Pierre into the making of a stupendous wager seemed to him rather ridiculous. With calculating coldness he was forced to concede that St. Pierre would be somewhat of a fool to accept the wager he had in mind, when he was so completely in St. Pierre's power. For Marie Anne and the chief of the Boulains, the bottom of the river would undoubtedly be the best and easiest solution, and the half-breed's suggestion might be acted upon after all. As his mind charged itself for the approaching struggle, David found himself staring at a double page in the magazine, given up entirely to impossibly slim young creatures exhibiting certain bits of elusive and mysterious feminine apparel. Marie Anne had expressed her approbation in the form of pencil notes under several of them. Under a cobwebby affair that wreathed one of the slim figures he read, "St. Pierre will love this." There were 2 exclamation points after that particular notation. David replaced the magazine on the table and looked toward the door. No, St. Pierre would not hesitate to put him at the bottom of the river, for her. Not if he, Dave Carrigan, made the solution of the matter a necessity. There were times, he told himself, when it was confoundedly embarrassing to force the letter of the law. And this was one of them. He was not afraid of the river bottom. He was thinking again of Marie Anne. The scraping of a canoe against the side of the bateau recalled him suddenly to the moment at hand. He heard low voices, and one of them, he knew, was St. Pierre's. For an interval the voices continued, frequently so low that he could not distinguish them at all. For 10 minutes he waited impatiently. Then the door swung open, and St. Pierre came in. Slowly and coolly David rose to meet him, and at the same moment the chief of the Boulains closed the door behind him. There was no greeting in Carrigan's manner. He was the law, waiting, unexcited, sure of himself, impassive as a thing of steel. He was ready to fight. He expected to fight. It only remained for St. Pierre to show what sort of fight it was to be. And he was amazed at St. Pierre, without betraying that amazement. In the vivid light that shot through the western windows the chief of the Boulains stood looking at David. He wore a gray flannel shirt open at the throat, and it was a splendid throat David saw, and a splendid head above it, with its reddish beard and hair. But what he saw chiefly were St. Pierre's eyes. They were the sort of eyes he disliked to find in an enemy, a grayish, steely blue that reflected sunlight like polished flint. But there was no flash of battle glow in them now. St. Pierre was neither excited nor in a bad humor. Nor did Carrigan's attitude appear to disturb him in the least. He was smiling. His eyes glowed with almost boyish curiosity as he stared appraisingly at David. And then, slowly, a low chuckle of laughter rose in his deep chest, and he advanced with an outstretched hand. "I am St. Pierre Boulain," he said. "I have heard a great deal about you, Sergeant Carrigan. You have had an unfortunate time." Had the man advanced menacingly, David would have felt more comfortable. It was disturbing to have this giant come to him with an extended hand of apparent friendship when he had anticipated an entirely different sort of meeting. And St. Pierre was laughing at him. There was no doubt of that. And he had the colossal nerve to tell him that he had been unfortunate, as though being shot up by somebody's wife was a fairly decent joke. Carrigan's attitude did not change. He did not reach out a hand to meet the other. There was no responsive glimmer of humor in his eyes or on his lips. And seeing these things, St. Pierre turned his extended hand to the open box of cigars, so that he stood for a moment with his back toward him. "It's funny," he said, as if speaking to himself, and with only a drawling note of the French patois in his voice. "I come home, find my Jeanne in a terrible mix-up, a stranger in her room, and the stranger refuses to let me laugh or shake hands with him. Tonnerre, I say it is funny. And my Jeanne saved his life, and made him muffins, and gave him my own bed, and walked with him in the forest. Ah, the ungrateful cochon!" He turned, laughing openly, so that his deep voice filled the cabin. "Vous avez de la corde pendue, monsieur. Yes, you are a lucky dog. For only one other man in the world would my Jeanne have done that. You are lucky because you are not ended behind the rock. You are lucky because you are not at the bottom of the river. You are lucky—" He shrugged his big shoulders hopelessly. "And now, after all our kindness and your good luck, you wait for me like an enemy, monsieur. Diable, I cannot understand. For the life of him Carrigan could not, in these few moments, measure up his man. He had said nothing. He had let St. Pierre talk. And now St. Pierre stood there, one of the finest men he had ever looked upon, as if honestly overcome by a great wonder. And yet behind that apparent incredulity in his voice and manner David sensed the deep underflow of another thing. St. Pierre was all that Marie Anne had claimed for him, and more. She had given him assurance of her unlimited confidence that her husband could adjust any situation in the world, and Carrigan conceded that St. Pierre measured up splendidly to that particular type of man. The smile had not left his face. The good humor was still in his eyes. David smiled back at him coldly. He recognized the cleverness of the other's play. St. Pierre was a man who would smile like that even as he fought, and Carrigan loved a smiling fighter, even when he had to slip steel bracelets over his wrists. "I am Sergeant Carrigan of N Division, Royal Northwest Mounted Police," he said, repeating the formula of the law. "Sit down, St. Pierre, and I will tell you a few things that have happened. And then—" "No, no, it is not necessary, monsieur. I have already listened for an hour, and I do not like to hear a story twice. You are of the police. I love the police. They are brave men, and brave men are my brothers. You are out after Roger Audemard, the rascal. Is it not so? And you were shot at behind the rock back there. You were almost killed. Ma foi, and it was my Jeanne who did the shooting. Yes, she thought you were another man." The chuckling, drum-like note of laughter came again out of St. Pierre's great chest. "It was bad shooting. I have taught her better, but the sun was blinding there in the hot white sand. And after that I know everything that has happened. Bateese was wrong. I shall scold him for wanting to put you at the bottom of the river. Perhaps. Oui, ce que femme veut. Dieu le veut, that is it. A woman must have her way, and my Jeanne's gentle heart was touched because you were a brave and handsome man, M'sieu Carrigan. But I am not jealous. Jealousy is a worm that does not make friendship. And we shall be friends. Only as a friend could I take you to the Chateau Boulain, far up on the Yellowknife. And we are going there." In spite of what might have been the entirely proper thing to do at this particular moment, Carrigan's face broke into a smile as he drew a second chair up close to the table. He was swift to readjust himself. It came suddenly back to him how he had grinned behind the rock, when death seemed close at hand. And St. Pierre was like that now. David measured him again as the chief of the Boulains sat down opposite him. Such a man could not be afraid of anything on the face of the earth, even of the law. The gleam that lay in his eyes told David that as they met his own over the table. "We are smiling now because it happens to please us," David read in them. "But in a moment, if it is necessary, we shall fight." Carrigan leaned a little over the table. "You know we are not going to the Chateau Boulain, St. Pierre," he said. "We are going to stop at Fort McMurray, and there you and your wife must answer for a number of things that have happened. There is one way out, possibly. That is largely up to you. Why did your wife try to kill me behind the rock? And what did you know about Black Roger Audemard?" St. Pierre's eyes did not for an instant leave Carrigan's face. Slowly a change came into them, the smile faded, the blue went out, and up from behind seemed to come another pair of eyes that were hard as steel and cold as ice. Yet they were not eyes that threatened, nor eyes that betrayed excitement or passion. And St. Pierre's voice, when he spoke, lacked the deep and vibrant note that had been in it. It was as if he had placed upon it the force of a mighty will, chaining it back, just as something hidden and terrible lay chained behind his eyes. "Why play like little children, M'sieu Carrigan?" he asked. "Why not come out squarely, honestly, like men? I know what has happened. Mon Dieu, it was bad. You were almost killed, and you heard that poor wreck Andre call for Roger Audemard. My Jeanne has told you about that, how I found him in the forest with his broken mind and body. And about my Jeanne—" St. Pierre's fists grew into knotted lumps on the table. "Non, I will die. I will kill you before I will tell you why she shot at you behind the rock. We are men, both of us. We are not afraid. And you, in my place, what would you do, monsieur?" In the moment's silence each man looked steadily at the other. "I would fight," said David slowly. "If it was for her, I am pretty sure I would fight." He believed that he was drawing the net in now, that it would catch St. Pierre. He leaned a little farther over the table. "And I, too, must fight," he added. "You know our law, St. Pierre. We don't go back without our man, unless we happen to die. And I would be stupid if I did not understand the situation here. It would be quite easy for you to get rid of me. But I don't believe you are a murderer, even if your Jeanne tried to be." A flicker of a smile crossed his lips. "And Marie Anne— I beg your pardon, your wife—" St. Pierre interrupted him. "It will please me to have you call her Marie Anne. And it will please her also, monsieur. Dieu, if we only had eyes that could see what is in a woman's heart! Life is funny, monsieur. It is a great joke, I swear it on my soul." He shrugged his shoulders, smiling again straight into David's eyes. "See what has happened? You set out for a murderer. My Jeanne makes a great mistake and shoots you. Then she pities you, saves your life, brings you here, and, ma foi, it is true, learns to care for you more than she should. But that does not make me want to kill you. No, her happiness is mine. Dead men tell no tales, monsieur, but there are times when living men also keep tales to themselves. And that is what you are going to do, Monsieur Carrigan. You are going to keep to yourself the thing that happened behind the rock. You are going to keep to yourself the mumblings of our poor mad Andre. Never will they pass your lips. I know. I swear it. I stake my life on it." St. Pierre was talking slowly and unexcitedly. There was an immeasurable confidence in his deep voice. It did not imply a threat or a warning. He was sure of himself. And his eyes had deepened into blue again and were almost friendly. "You would stake your life?" repeated Carrigan questioningly. "You would do that?" St. Pierre rose to his feet and looked about the cabin with a shining light in his eyes that was both pride and exultation. He moved toward the end of the room where the piano stood, and for a moment his big fingers touched the keys. Then, seeing the lacy bit of handkerchief that lay there, he picked it up and placed it back again. Carrigan did not urge his question, but waited. In spite of his effort to fight it down, he found himself in the grip of a mysterious and growing thrill as he watched St. Pierre. Never had the presence of another man had the same effect upon him, and strangely the thought came to him that he was matched, even overmatched. It was as if St. Pierre had brought with him into the cabin something more than the splendid strength of his body, a thing that reached out in the interval of silence between them, warning Carrigan that all the law in the world would not swerve the chief of the Boulains from what was already in his mind. For a moment the thought passed from David that fate had placed him up against the hazard of enmity with St. Pierre. His vision centered in the man alone. And as he, too, rose to his feet, an unconscious smile came to his lips as he recalled the boastings of Bateese. "I ask you," said he, "if you would really stake your life in a matter such as that?" Of course, if your words were merely accidental, and meant nothing—" "If I had a dozen lives, I would stake them, one on top of the other, as I have said," interrupted St. Pierre. Suddenly his laugh boomed out, and his voice became louder. "M'sieu Carrigan, I have come to offer you just that test. Oui, I could kill you now. I could put you at the bottom of the river, as Bateese thinks is right. Mon Dieu, how completely I could make you disappear! And then my Jeanne would be safe. She would not go behind prison bars. She would go on living, and laughing, and singing in the big forests where she belongs. And Black Roger Audemard, the rascal, would be safe for a time. But that would be like destroying a little child. You are so helpless now. So you are going on to the Chateau Boulain with us. And if at the end of the second month from today you do not willingly say I have won my wager, why, m'sieu, I will go with you into the forest, and you may shoot out of me the life which is my end of the gamble. Is that not fair? Can you suggest a better way, between men like you and me?" "I can at least suggest a way that has the virtue of saving time," replied David. "First, however, I must understand my position here. I am, I take it, a prisoner?" "A guest, with certain restrictions placed upon you, m'sieu," corrected St. Pierre. The eyes of the two men met on a dead level. "Tomorrow morning I am going to fight Bateese," said David. "It is a little sporting event we have fixed up between us for the amusement of your men. I have heard that Bateese is the best fighting man along the Three Rivers. And I do not like to have any other man claim that distinction when I am around." For the first time St. Pierre's placidity seemed to leave him. His brow became clouded, a moment's frown grew in his face, and there was a certain disconsolate hopelessness in the shrug of his shoulders. It was as if Carrigan's words had suddenly robbed the day of all its sunshine for the chief of the Boulains. His voice, too, carried an unhappy and disappointed note as he made a gesture toward the window. "M'sieu, on that raft out there are many of my men, and they have scarcely rested or slept since word was brought to them that a stranger was to fight Concombre Bateese. Tonnerre, they have gambled without ever seeing you until the clothes on their backs are in the hazard, and they have cracked their muscles in labor to overtake you. They have prayed away their very souls that it would be a good fight, and that Bateese would not eat you up too quickly. It has been a long time since we have seen a good fight, a long time since the last man dared to stand up against the half-breed. Ugh, it tears out my heart to tell you that the fight can not be." St. Pierre made no effort to suppress his emotion. He was like a huge, disappointed boy. He walked to the window, peered forth at the raft, and as he shrugged his big shoulders again something like a groan came from him. The thrill of approaching triumph swept through David's blood. The flame of it was in his eyes when St. Pierre turned from the window. "And you are disappointed, St. Pierre? You would like to see that fight?" The blue steel in St. Pierre's eyes flashed back. "If the price were a year of my life, I would give it, if Bateese did not eat you up too quickly. I love to look upon a good fight, where there is no venom of hatred in the blows." "Then you shall see a good fight, St. Pierre." "Bateese would kill you, m'sieu. You are not big. You are not his match." "I shall whip him, St. Pierre, whip him until he avows me his master." "You do not know the half-breed, m'sieu. Twice I have tried him in friendly combat myself, and have been beaten." "But I shall whip him," repeated Carrigan. "I will wager you anything in the world, even life against life, that I whip him." The gloom had faded from the face of St. Pierre Boulain. But in a moment it clouded again. My Jeanne has made me promise that I will stop the fight," he said. "And why? Why should she insist in a matter such as this, which properly should be settled among men?" asked David. Again St. Pierre laughed. With an effort, it seemed, "She is gentle-hearted, m'sieu. She laughed and thought it quite a joke when Bateese humbled me. What, my great St. Pierre, with the blood of old France in his veins, beaten by a man who has been named after a vegetable?" she cried. "I tell you she was merry over it, m'sieu. She laughed until the tears came into her eyes. But with you it is different. She was white when she entreated me not to let you fight Bateese. Yes, she is afraid you will be badly hurt. And she does not want to see you hurt again. But I tell you that I am not jealous, m'sieu. She does not try to hide things from me. She tells me everything, like a little child. And so—" "I am going to fight Bateese," said David. He wondered if St. Pierre could hear the thumping of his heart, or if his face gave betrayal of the hot flood that was pumping through his body. "Bateese and I have pledged ourselves. We shall fight, unless you tie one of us hand and foot. And as for a wager—" "Yes. What have you to wager?" demanded St. Pierre eagerly. "You know the odds are great," temporized Carrigan. "That I concede, m'sieu." "But a fight without a wager would be like a pipe without tobacco, St. Pierre." "You speak truly, m'sieu." David came nearer and laid a hand on the other's arm. "St. Pierre, I hope you and your Jeanne will understand what I am about to offer. It is this. If Bateese whips me I will disappear into the forests, and no word shall ever pass my lips of what has passed since that hour behind the rock, and this. No whisper of it will ever reach the law. I will forget the attempted murder and the suspicious mumblings of your Broken Man. You will be safe. Your Jeanne will be safe, if Bateese whips me." He paused and waited. St. Pierre made no answer, but amazement came into his face, and after that a slow and burning fire in his eyes which told how deeply and vitally Carrigan's words had struck into his soul. "And if I should happen to win," continued David, turning a bit carelessly toward the window, "why, I should expect as large a payment from you. If I win, your fulfillment of the wager will be to tell me in every detail why your wife tried to kill me behind the rock, and you will also tell me all that you know about the man that I am after, Black Roger Audemard. That is all. I am asking for no odds, though you concede the handicap is great." He did not look at St. Pierre. Behind him he heard the other's deep breathing. For a space neither spoke. Outside they could hear the soft swish of water, the low voices of men in the stern, and a shout and the barking of a dog coming from the raft far out on the river. For David the moment was one of suspense. He turned again, a bit carelessly, as if his proposition were a matter of but little significance to him. St. Pierre was not looking at him. He was staring toward the door, as if through it he could see the powerful form of Bateese bending over the stern sweep. And Carrigan could see that his face was flaming with a great desire, and that the blood in his body was pounding to the mighty urge of it. Suddenly he faced Carrigan. "M'sieu, listen to me," he said. "You are a brave man. You are a man of honor, and I know you will bury sacredly in your heart what I am going to tell you now, and never let a word of it escape, even to my Jeanne. I do not blame you for loving her. Non. You could not help that. You have fought well to keep it within yourself, and for that I honor you. How do I know? Mon Dieu, she has told me. A woman's heart understands, and a woman's ears are quick to hear, m'sieu. When you were sick and your mind was wandering, You told her again and again that you loved her, and when she brought you back to life her eyes saw more than once the truth of what your lips had betrayed, though you tried to keep it to yourself. Even more, monsieur, she felt the touch of your lips on her hair that day. She understands. She has told me everything, openly, innocently, yet her heart thrills with that sympathy of a woman who knows she is loved. Monsieur, if you could have seen the light in her eyes and the glow in her cheeks as she told me these secrets. But I am not jealous. No, it is only because you are a brave man and one of honor that I tell you all this. She would die of shame did she know I had betrayed her confidence. Yet it is necessary that I tell you, because if we make the big wager, we must drop my Jeanne from the gamble. Do you comprehend me, monsieur? We are two men, strong men, fighting men. I, Pierre Boulain, cannot feel the shame of jealousy where a woman's heart is pure and sweet, and where a man has fought against love with honor as you have fought. And you, monsieur, David Carrigan, of the police, cannot strike with your hard man's hand that tender heart that is like a flower, and which this moment is beating faster than it should with the fear that some harm is going to befall you. Is it not so, monsieur? We will make the wager, yes. But if you whip Bateese, and you cannot do that in 100 years of fighting, I will not tell you why my Jeanne shot at you behind the rock. No, never. Yet I swear I will tell you the other. If you win, I will tell you all I know about Roger Audemard, and that is considerable, monsieur. Do you agree?" Slowly David held out a hand. St. Pierre gripped it. The fingers of the two men met like bands of steel. "Tomorrow you will fight," said St. Pierre. "You will fight and be beaten so terribly that you may always show the marks of it. I am sorry. Such a man as you I would rather have as a brother than an enemy. And she will never forgive me. She will always remember it. The thought will never die out of her heart that I was a beast to let you fight Bateese. But it is best for all. And my men? Ah, diable, but it will be great sport for them, monsieur." His hand unclasped. He turned to the door. A moment later it closed behind him, and David was alone. He had not spoken. He had not replied to the engulfing truths that had fallen quietly and without a betrayal of passion from St. Pierre's lips. Inwardly he was crushed. Yet his face was like stone, hiding his shame. And then, suddenly, there came a sound from outside that sent the blood through his cold veins again. It was laughter, the great booming laughter of St. Pierre. It was not the merriment of a man whose heart was bleeding, or into whose life had come an unexpected pain or grief. It was wild and free, and filled with the joy of the sun-filled day. And David, listening to it, felt something that was more than admiration for this man growing within him. And unconsciously his lips repeated St. Pierre's words. "Tomorrow you will fight." End of chapter 16. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 17 of The Flaming Forest. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Flaming Forest by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. For many minutes David stood at the bateau window and watched the canoe that carried St. Pierre Boulain and the Broken Man back to the raft. It moved slowly, as if St. Pierre was loitering with a purpose and was thinking deeply of what had passed. Carrigan's fingers tightened, and his face grew tense as he gazed out into the glow of the western sun. Now that the stress of nerve-breaking moments in the cabin was over, he no longer made an effort to preserve the veneer of coolness and decision with which he had encountered the chief of the Boulains. Deep in his soul he was crushed and humiliated. Every nerve in his body was bleeding. He had heard St. Pierre's big laugh a moment before, but it must have been the laugh of a man who was stabbed to the heart. And he was going back to Marie Anne like that, drifting scarcely faster than the current, that he might steal time to strengthen himself before he looked into her eyes again. David could see him, motionless, his giant shoulders hunched forward a little, his head bowed, and in the stern the Broken Man paddled listlessly, his eyes in the face of his master. Without voice, David cursed himself. In his egoism he had told himself that he had made a splendid fight in resisting the temptation of a great love for the wife of St. Pierre. But what was his own struggle compared with this tragedy which St. Pierre was now facing? He turned from the window and looked about the cabin room again, the woman's room and St. Pierre's, and his face burned in its silent accusation. Like a living thing it painted another picture for him. For a space he lost his own identity. He saw himself in the place of St. Pierre. He was the husband of Marie Anne, worshipping her even as St. Pierre must worship her, and he came, as St. Pierre had come, to find a stranger in his home, a stranger who had lain in his bed, a stranger whom his wife had nursed back to life, a stranger who had fallen in love with his most inviolable possession, who had told her of his love, who had kissed her, who had held her close, in his arms, whose presence had brought a warmer flush and a brighter glow into eyes and cheeks that until this stranger's coming had belonged only to him. And he heard her, as St. Pierre had heard her, pleading with him to keep this man from harm. He heard her soft voice, telling of the things which had passed between them, and he saw in her eyes— With almost a cry he swept the thought and the picture from him. It was an atrocious thing to conceive, impossible of reality. And yet the truth would not go. What would he have done in St. Pierre's place? He went to the window again. Yes, St. Pierre was a bigger man than he. For St. Pierre had come quietly and calmly, offering a hand of friendship, generous, smiling, keeping his hurt to himself, while he, Dave Carrigan, would have come with the murder of man in his heart. His eyes passed from the canoe to the raft, and from the big raft to the hazy billows of green and golden forest that melted off into interminable miles of distance beyond the river. He knew that on the other side of him lay that same distance, north, east, south, and west, vast spaces in an unpeopled world, the same green and golden forests, 10,000 plains and rivers and lakes, a million hiding places where romance and tragedy might remain forever undisturbed. The thought came to him that it would not be difficult to slip out into that world and disappear. He almost owed it to St. Pierre. It was the voice of Bateese in a snatch of wild and discordant song that brought him back into grim reality. There was, after all, that embarrassing matter of justice and the accursed law. After a little he observed that the canoe was moving faster, and that Andre's paddle was working steadily and with force. St. Pierre no longer sat hunched in the bow. His head was erect, and he was waving a hand in the direction of the raft. A figure had come from the cabin on the huge mass of floating timber. David caught the shimmer of a woman's dress, something white fluttering over her head, waving back at St. Pierre. It was Marie Anne, and he moved away from the window. He wondered what was passing between St. Pierre and his wife in the hour that followed. The bateau kept abreast of the raft, moving neither faster nor slower than it did, and twice he surrendered to the desire to scan the deck of the floating timbers through his binoculars. But the cabin held St. Pierre and Marie Anne, and he saw neither of them again until the sun was setting. Then St. Pierre came out, alone. Even at that distance over the broad river he heard the booming voice of the chief of the Boulains. Life sprang up where there had been the drowse of inactivity aboard the raft. A dozen more of the great sweeps were swiftly manned by men who appeared suddenly from the shadowed places of canvas shelters and striped tents. A murmur of voices rose over the water, and then the murmur was broken by howls and shouts as the rivermen ran to their places at the command of St. Pierre's voice, and as the sweeps began to flash in the setting sun, it gave way entirely to the evening chant of the paddling song. David gripped himself as he listened and watched the slowly drifting glory of the world that came down to the shores of the river. He could see St. Pierre clearly, for the bateau had worked its way nearer. He could see the bare heads and naked arms of the rivermen at the sweeps. The sweet breath of the forests filled his lungs as that picture lay before him, and there came into his soul a covetousness and a yearning where before there had been humiliation and the grim urge of duty. He could breathe the air of that world, he could look at its beauty, he could worship it, and yet he knew that he was not a part of it as those others were a part of it. He envied the men at the sweeps. He felt his heart swelling at the exultation and joy in their song. They were going home, home down the big rivers, home to the heart of God's country, where wives and sweethearts and happiness were waiting for them. And their visions were his visions as he stared wide-eyed and motionless over the river. And yet he was irrevocably an alien. He was more than that, an enemy, a man-hound sent out on a trail to destroy, an agent of a powerful and merciless force that carried with it punishment and death. The crew of the bateau had joined in the evening song of the rivermen on the raft, and over the ridges and hollows of the forest tops, red and green and gold in the last warm glory of the sun, echoed that chanting voice of men. David understood now what St. Pierre's command had been. The huge raft with its tented city of life was preparing to tie up for the night. A quarter of a mile ahead the river widened, so that on the far side was a low, clean shore toward which the efforts of the men at the sweeps were slowly edging the raft. York boats shot out on the shore side and dropped anchors that helped drag the big craft in. Two others tugged at tow lines fastened to the shoreside bow, and within 20 minutes the first men were plunging up out of the water on the white strip of beach and were whipping the tie lines about the nearest trees. David unconsciously was smiling in the thrill and triumph of these last moments, and not until they were over did he sense the fact that Bateese and his crew were bringing the bateau in to the opposite shore. Before the sun was quite down, both raft and houseboat were anchored for the night. As the shadows of the distant forests deepened, Carrigan felt impending about him an oppression of emptiness and loneliness which he had not experienced before. He was disappointed that the bateau had not tied up with the raft. Already he could see men building fires. Spirals of smoke began to rise from the shore, and he knew that the riverman's happiest of all hours, supper time, was close at hand. He looked at his watch. It was after 7 o'clock. Then he watched the fading away of the sun until only the red glow of it remained in the west, and against the still thicker shadows the fires of the rivermen threw up yellow flames. On his own side, Bateese and the bateau crew were preparing their meal. It was 8 o'clock when a man he had not seen before brought in his supper. He ate, scarcely sensing the taste of his food, and half an hour later the man reappeared for the dishes. It was not quite dark when he returned to his window, but the far shore was only an indistinct blur of gloom. The fires were brighter. One of them, built solely because of the riverman's inherent love of light and cheer, threw the blaze of its flaming logs 20 feet into the air. He wondered what Marie Anne was doing in this hour. Last night they had been together. He had marveled at the witchery of the moonlight in her hair and eyes. He had told her of the beauty of it. She had smiled. She had laughed softly with him. For hours they had sat in the spell of the golden night and the glory of the river. And tonight, now, was she with St. Pierre, waiting as they had waited last night for the rising of the moon? Had she forgotten? Could she forget? Or was she, as he thought St. Pierre had painfully tried to make him believe, innocent of all the thoughts and desires that had come to him as he sat worshipping her in their stolen hours? He could think of them only as stolen, for he did not believe Marie Anne had revealed to her husband all she might have told him. He was sure he would never see her again as he had seen her then, and something of bitterness rose in him as he thought of that. St. Pierre, could he have seen her face and eyes when he told her that her hair in the moonlight was lovelier than anything he had ever seen, would have throttled him with his naked hands in that meeting in the cabin. For St. Pierre's code would not have had her eyes droop under their long lashes or her cheeks flush so warmly at the words of another man, and he could not take vengeance on the woman herself. No, she had not told St. Pierre all she might have told. There were things which she must have kept to herself, which she dared not reveal even to this great-hearted man who was her husband. Shame, if nothing more, had kept her silent. Did she feel that shame as he was feeling it? It was inconceivable to think otherwise. And for that reason, more than all others, he knew that she would not meet him face to face again, unless he forced that meeting. And there was little chance of that, for his pledge with St. Pierre had eliminated her from the aftermath of tomorrow's drama, his fight with Bateese. Only when St. Pierre might stand in a court of law would there be a possibility of her eyes meeting his own again, and then they would flame with the hatred that at another time had been in the eyes of Carmin Fanchet. With the dull stab of a thing that of late had been growing inside him, he wondered what had happened to Carmin Fanchet in the years that had gone since he had brought about the hanging of her brother. Last night and the night before, strange dreams of her had come to him in restless slumber. It was disturbing to him that he should wake up in the middle of the night dreaming of her, when he had gone to his bed with a mind filled to overflowing with the sweet presence of Marie Anne Boulain. And now his mind reached out poignantly into mysterious darkness and doubt, even as the darkness of night spread itself in a thickening canopy over the river. Gray clouds had followed the sun of a faultless day, and the stars were veiled overhead. When David turned from the window, it was so dark in the cabin that he could not see. He did not light the lamps, but made his way to St. Pierre's couch, and sat down in the silence and gloom. Through the open windows came to him the cadence of the river and the forests. There was silence of human voice ashore, but under him he heard the lapping murmur of water as it rustled under the stern and side of the bateau, and from the deep timber came the never-ceasing whisper of the spruce and cedar tops, and the subdued voice of creatures whose hours of activity had come with the dying out of the sun. For a long time he sat in this darkness. And then there came to him a sound that was different than the other sounds, a low monotone of voices, the dipping of a paddle, and a canoe passed close under his window and up the shore. He paid small attention to it until, a little later, the canoe returned, and its occupants boarded the bateau. It would have roused little interest in him then had he not heard a voice that was thrillingly like the voice of a woman. He drew his hunched shoulders erect and stared through the darkness toward the door. A moment more, and there was no doubt. It was almost shock that sent the blood leaping suddenly through his veins. The inconceivable had happened. It was Marie Anne out there, talking in a low voice to Bateese. Then there came a heavy knock at his door, and he heard the door open. Through it he saw the grayer gloom of the outside night partly shut out a heavy shadow. "M'sieu," called the voice of Bateese. "I am here," said David. "You have not gone to bed, m'sieu?" "No." The heavy shadow seemed to fade away, and yet there still remained a shadow there. David's heart thumped as he noted the slenderness of it. For a space there was silence. And then, "Will you light the lamps, M'sieu David?" a soft voice came to him. "I want to come in, and I am afraid of this terrible darkness." He rose to his feet, fumbling in his pocket for matches. Chapter 17. Recording by Roger Melin. Chapter 18 of The Flaming Forest. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melin. The Flaming Forest by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 18. He did not turn toward Marie Anne when he had lighted the first of the great brass lamps hanging at the side of the bateau. He went to the second and struck another match, and flooded the cabin with light. She still stood silhouetted against the darkness beyond the cabin door when he faced her. She was watching him, her eyes intent, her face a little pale, he thought. Then he smiled and nodded. He could not see a great change in her since this afternoon, except that there seemed to be a little more fire in the glow of her eyes. They were looking at him steadily as she smiled and nodded, wide, beautiful eyes, in which there was surely no revelation of shame or regret, and no very clear evidence of unhappiness. David stared, and his tongue clove to the roof of his mouth. "Why is it that you sit in darkness?" she asked, stepping within and closing the door. "Did you not expect me to return and apologize for leaving you so suddenly this afternoon? It was impolite. Afterward I was ashamed. But I was excited, M'sieu David. I—" "Of course," he hurried to interrupt her. "I understand. St. Pierre is a lucky man. I congratulate you, as well as him. He is splendid, a man in whom you can place great faith and confidence." "He scolded me for running away from you as I did, M'sieu David. He said I should have shown better courtesy than to leave like that one who was a guest in our home. So I have returned, like a good child, to make amends." "It was not necessary." "But you were lonesome and in darkness." He nodded. "Yes." "And besides," she added, so quietly and calmly that he was amazed, "you know my sleeping apartment is also on the bateau, and St. Pierre made me promise to say good night to you." "It is an imposition," cried David, the blood rushing to his face. "You have given up all this to me. Why not let me go into that little room forward, or sleep on the raft, and you and St. Pierre—" "St. Pierre would not leave the raft," replied Marie Anne, turning from him toward the table on which were the books and magazines and her work basket. "And I like my little room forward." "St. Pierre—" He stopped himself. He could see a sudden color deepening in the cheek of St. Pierre's wife as she made pretense of looking for something in her basket. He felt that if he went on he would blunder, if he had not already blundered. He was uncomfortable, for he believed he had guessed the truth. It was not quite reasonable to expect that Marie Anne would come to him like this on the first night of St. Pierre's homecoming. Something had happened over in the little cabin on the raft, he told himself. Perhaps there had been a quarrel, at least ironical implications on St. Pierre's part. and his sympathy was with St. Pierre. He caught suddenly a little tremble at the corner of Marie Anne's mouth as her face was turned partly from him, and he stepped to the opposite side of the table so he could look at her fairly. If there had been unpleasantness in the cabin on the raft, St. Pierre's wife in no way gave evidence of it. The color had deepened to almost a blush in her cheeks, but it was not on account of embarrassment, for one who is embarrassed is not usually amused, and as she looked up at him her eyes were filled with the flash of laughter which he had caught her lips struggling to restrain. Then, finding a bit of lacework with the needles meshed in it, she seated herself, and again he was looking down on the droop of her long lashes and the seductive glow of her lustrous hair. Yesterday, in a moment of irresistible impulse, he had told her how lovely it was as she had dressed it, a bewitching crown of interwoven coils, not drawn tightly, but crumpled and soft, as if the mass of tresses were openly rebelling at closer confinement. She had told him the effect was entirely accidental, largely due to carelessness and haste in dressing it. Accidental or otherwise, it was the same tonight, and in the heart of it were the drooping red petals of a flower she had gathered with him early that afternoon. "St. Pierre brought me over," she said in a calmly matter-of-fact voice, as though she had expected David to know that from the beginning. "He is ashore, talking over important matters with Bateese. I am sure he will drop in and say good night before he returns to the raft. He asked me to wait for him, here." She raised her eyes, so clear and untroubled, so quietly unembarrassed under his gaze, that he would have staked his life she had no suspicion of the confessions which St. Pierre had revealed to him. "Do you care? Would you rather put out the lights and go to bed?" He shook his head. "No, I am glad. I was beastly lonesome. I had an idea—" He was on the point of blundering again when he caught himself. The effect of her so near him was more than ever disturbing, in spite of St. Pierre. Her eyes, clear and steady, yet soft as velvet when they looked at him, made his tongue and his thoughts dangerously uncertain. "You had an idea, M'sieu David?" "That you would have no desire to see me again after my talk with St. Pierre," he said. "Did he tell you about it?" "He said you were very fine, M'sieu David, and that he liked you." "And he told you it is determined that I shall fight Bateese in the morning?" "Yes." The one word was spoken with a quiet lack of excitement, even of interest. It seemed to belie some of the things St. Pierre had told him, and he could scarcely believe, looking at her now, that she had entreated her husband to prevent the encounter, or that she had betrayed any unusual emotion in the matter at all. "I was afraid you would object," he could not keep from saying. "It does not seem nice to pull off such a thing as that, when there is a lady about—" "Or ladies!" She caught him up quickly, and he saw a sudden little tightening of her pretty mouth as she turned her eyes to the bit of lacework again. "But I do not object, because what St. Pierre says is right, must be right." And the softness, he thought, went altogether out of the curve of her lips for an instant. In a flash their momentary betrayal of vexation was gone, and St. Pierre's wife had replaced the work-basket on the table and was on her feet, smiling at him. There was something of wild daring in her eyes, something that made him think of the glory of adventure he had seen flaming in her face the night they had run the rapids of the Holy Ghost. "Tomorrow will be very unpleasant, M'sieu David," she cried softly. "Bateese will beat you terribly. Tonight we must think of things more agreeable." He had never seen her more radiant than when she turned toward the piano. What the deuce did it mean? Had St. Pierre been making a fool of him? She actually appeared unable to restrain her elation at the thought that Bateese would surely beat him up. He stood without moving and made no effort to answer her. Just before they had started on that thrilling adventure into the forest, which had ended with his carrying her in his arms, she had gone to the piano and had played for him. Now her fingers touched softly the same notes. A little humming thrill came in her throat, and it seemed to David that she was deliberately recalling his thoughts to the things that had happened before the coming of St. Pierre. He had not lighted the lamp over the piano, and for a flash her dark eyes smiled at him out of the half shadow. After a moment she began to sing. Her voice was low and without effort, untrained, and subdued as if conscious and afraid of its limitations, yet so exquisitely sweet that to David it was a new and still more wonderful revelation of St. Pierre's wife. He drew nearer until he stood close at her side, the dark luster of her hair almost touching his arm, her partly upturned face a bewitching profile in the shadows. Her voice grew lower, almost a whisper in its melody, as if meant for him alone. Many times he had heard the Canadian boat song, but never as its words came now from the lips of Marie Anne Boulain. Faintly as tolls the evening chime, our voices keep tune and our oars keep time. Soon as the woods on shore look dim, we'll sing at St. Anne's our parting hymn. Row, brothers, row, the stream runs fast. The rapids are near, and the daylight's past. She paused, and David, staring down at her shining head, did not speak. Her fingers trembled over the keys. He could see dimly the shadow of her long lashes, and the spirit-like scent of crushed violets rose to him from the soft lace about her throat and her hair. "It is your music," he whispered. "I have never heard the boat song like that." He tried to drag his eyes from her face and hair, sensing that he was a near criminal, fighting a mighty impulse. The notes under her fingers changed, and again, by chance or design, she was stabbing at him, bringing him face to face with the weakness of his flesh, the iniquity of his desire to reach out his arms and crumple her in them. Yet she did not look up, she did not see him as she began to sing Ave Maria. Ave Maria, hear me cry. O guide my path where no harm is nigh. As she went on, he knew she had forgotten to think of him. With the reverence of a prayer the holy words came from her lips, slowly, softly, trembling with a pathos and sweetness that told David they came not alone from the lips, but from the very soul of St. Pierre's wife. And then, O Mother, hear me where thou art, and guide my aching heart, my aching heart. The last words drifted away into a whisper, and David was glad that he was not looking into the face of St. Pierre's wife, for there must have been something there now which it would have been sacrilege for him to stare at, as he was staring at her hair. No sound of opening door had come from behind them. Yet St. Pierre had opened it and stood there, watching them with a curious humor in eyes that seemed still to hold a glitter of the fire that had leaped from the half-breed's flaming birch logs. His voice was a shock to Carrigan. "Peste, but you are a gloomy pair," he boomed. "Why no light over there in the corner, and why sing that death song to chase away the devil when there is no devil near?" Guilt was in David's heart, but there was no sting of venom in St. Pierre's words, and he was laughing at them now, as though what he saw were a pretty joke and amused him. "Late hours and shady bowers. I say it should be a love song or something livelier," he cried, closing the door behind him and coming toward them. "Why not Enroulant ma boule, my sweet Jeanne? You know that is my favorite." He suddenly interrupted himself, and his voice rolled out in a wild chant that rocked the cabin. "The wind is fresh, the wind is free, En roulant ma boule. The wind is fresh, my love waits me.
Roulis, roulin, ma boule roulin. Behind our house a spring you see, in it 3 ducks swim merrily, and hunting the prince's son went he, with a silver gun right fair to see. David was conscious that St. Pierre's wife had risen to her feet, and now she came out of shadow into light, and he was amazed to see that she was laughing back at St. Pierre, and that her 2 forefingers were thrust in her ears to keep out the bellow of her husband's voice. She was not at all discomfited by his unexpected appearance, but rather seemed to join in the humor of the thing with St. Pierre, though he fancied he could see something in her face that was forced and uneasy. He believed that under the surface of her composure she was suffering a distress which she did not reveal. St. Pierre advanced and carelessly patted her shoulder with one of his big hands, while he spoke to David. "Has she not the sweetest voice in the world, monsieur? Did you ever hear a sweeter or as sweet? I say it is enough to get down into the soul of a man, unless he is already half dead. That voice!" He caught Marie Anne's eyes. Her cheeks were flaming. Her look, for an instant, flashed lightning as she halted him. "Ma foi, I speak it from the heart," he persisted, with a shrug of his shoulders. "Am I not right, Monsieur Carrigan? Did you ever hear a sweeter voice?" "It is wonderful," agreed David, wondering if he was hazarding too much. "Good! It fills me with happiness to know I am right. And now, cherie, good night. I must return to the raft." A shadow of vexation crossed Marie Anne's face. "You seem in great haste." "Plagues and pests! You are right, pretty voice. I am most anxious to get back to my troubles there, and you—" "Will also bid M'sieu Carrigan good night," she quickly interrupted him. "You will at least see me to my room, St. Pierre, and safely put away for the night." She held out her hand to David. There was not a tremor in it as it lay for an instant soft and warm in his own. She made no effort to withdraw it quickly, nor did her eyes hide their softness as they looked into his own. Mutely David stood as they went out. He heard St. Pierre's loud voice rumbling about the darkness of the night. He heard them pass along the side of the bateau forward, and half a minute later he knew that St. Pierre was getting into his canoe. The dip of a paddle came to him. For a space there was silence, and then, from far out in the black shadow of the river, rolled back the great voice of St. Pierre Boulain, singing the wild river chant, En roulant ma boule. At the open window he listened. It seemed to him that from far over the river, where the giant raft lay, there came a faint answer to the words of the song. End of chapter 18. Recording by Roger Melin.